Okay, everybody. So welcome to this final of the five sessions. This is not the end, of course, of the program. This is just part of the way through work stream one. We've got a lot of things happening over the coming weeks and months before we get to the big hybrid workshop in Brussels in October. And we'll remind you of that when we get to the end of the session. I don't know if do you want to say anything about this final session or where we're going, Martin or Lena, at this point?
Really, I think you said the maximum, the most important information. Just happy to see everyone again. It is indeed the last session, as you said, but not the end of the community, not even the work stream. Obviously, the event in Brussels in October is going to be the logical next step. So we'll be contacting the focal points of your countries and territories and making sure that we've got the right participants for this event. And just wishing everybody a successful last session and good luck. And over to you, Matthew.
Okay. All right, great. So the final session is all about monitoring and evaluation and thinking about the tools that we have or the tools that we require to engage in monitoring. And I suppose by way of introduction, it's worth just sort of making the point that this is, in a sense, the final stage on our policy cycle process. If you think about some of the diagrams that we've shown you previously. But at the same time, this isn't something that has to come at the end of a given process, because as we've also talked about, the things that we're interested in, adaptation and resilience building, don't ever come to an end. They keep going. They're ongoing processes. So in that sense, they're cyclical. They're not things that have a beginning and an end point. They're not linear. So they should be cyclical, which means that monitoring and evaluation is something that you can start really at any stage of the policy cycle. You can, although we conceive of it as being coming late on after something has happened, there's no reason why that's really the case. Monitoring is something that you want to build in at any point in time. So one of the things that we were quite keen to emphasize, that we'll continue to re-emphasize, is that this is something that you don't have to wait to do. So you don't have to wait until you've got a huge evidence base. You don't have to wait until a policy or an agenda has been fully implemented. You can start building monitoring strategies from very, very early on. Even if you don't have much in the way of data, as long as you know which questions you want to ask and what things you want to find out, you can start to build in rudimentary or even quite complex systems of monitoring and evaluation from very, very early on in your kind of adaptation and adjustment process. So everybody's been to every session, I think, so far. This is the fifth one. We're looking at different tools to support the mainstreaming of resilience, so different monitoring and evaluation tools. And we've got five sort of broad objectives here today. The first one is we're going to just think about what M&E is and what the different functions of it are. And I'm sure many of you have engaged in M&E processes in some respect or another, whether or not to do with adaptation specifically. We're going to think about some of the challenges in carrying out adaptation monitoring and evaluation specifically. We're going to look at some different methods for monitoring and evaluation. And then we're going to practice the development of our own system and indicators. So we've got another Miro board activity, which shouldn't be too complicated, that encourages you to think about what an appropriate M&E system for your own adaptation contexts might be, that we'll do towards the end. So the agenda for today essentially follows that framework that I've just laid out. Okay, so what is monitoring and evaluation? What do we mean when we talk about this process? Essentially, it entails tracking, and this is a quote, progress made in implementing a specific adaptation action in relation to its objectives and inputs. So monitoring is about tracking progress of implementation. It's kind of the constant review of the things that you're trying to do in terms of your policy implementation. So constant review, as we say on the slide here, of the project stroke program stroke policy in the context of its organization through a combination of established intermediate outcomes, evaluation questions, and indicators. That's quite a complicated way of saying that essentially what we're trying to do is just weigh up what is being done, how it's being done, and whether it's successful. The evaluation part is the kind of success part. So monitoring, on the one hand, involves the collection, analysis, communication, and use of information on the state of progress of the thing that you're interested in looking at. By contrast, evaluation, as the word suggests, is about appraisal of the activity. So you're not just looking at what's being done or how things are going, you're looking at the extent of the success or otherwise of the thing that's happening. So a definition of evaluation is that it aims to systematically and objectively determine the effectiveness of an adaptation action. So how well is this thing working? And there's a whole set of different ways by which we might measure that success. We could be thinking about questions of efficiency. We could be asking questions about equity. We could be asking questions about, how the different consequences of a particular process fall on particular groups of people. There are lots of different ways we can determine how to evaluate the success or otherwise of a project. And sometimes we also need to think about learning, and this is seen to be quite an Anglo-American kind of idea. It's predominant in the UK and Canada and the US M&E type frameworks, implementing the idea of learning. So this notion that we're not just interested in monitoring something, looking at kind of, what's happening. We're not only interested in evaluating it, but we're also interested in learning about it. So how do the things we take from the monitoring evaluation process feed into those processes of learning that allow us to then change things? So it's kind of an integrated systemic approach to thinking about how well things are going, but also informing course corrections, also informing changes, also informing improvements in the thing that we're interested in. So overall, according to the IPCC, monitoring and evaluation and learning are absolutely crucial for adaptation specifically, because it's this iterative process that allows the adaptation process to improve over time. And this is particularly important given the nature of the climate risks, and the effectiveness or consequences of adaptation interventions also become better understood over time. So the better our understanding of how processes function, the more we can adjust and change and improve the way in which we both implement them and also understand the consequences of that implementation. So overall, a monitoring and evaluation system and learning system includes a whole range of different elements. And this includes setting objectives, managing data and information, reporting on progress, results and lessons learned. And all of this can happen throughout every single phase of adaptation, right the way from planning all the way through to implementation, as I said earlier. So that's a kind of very brief overview of what these processes are or what these words mean. And integral to thinking about them is kind of the importance of the data that you use to inform the analysis. But it's not just about data, and there are many, many different kinds of data that you can generate, and that might be a conversation that we want to get into as we go forward in this session. But it's also important to think not just about the actual data you want, but how you go about collecting it, how you also circulate it, how you communicate the lessons from the processes that you're monitoring and evaluating and learning from. So what is the purpose of monitoring and evaluation? Well, there are a number of things I guess we could say here. One is simply about steering the project itself. So working out how you might make adjustments or reorientations. This is sometimes called adaptive management, how you might be able to continually improve a given project or process as you go along, helps you learn and take stock of the success or otherwise of the thing that you're implementing. There are questions here of transparency as well, making it clear to your stakeholders, both the people that are funding the process or the people that are experiencing the consequences of it, that you've actually done, some proper stock taking, and you can tell them using evidence how effective or otherwise the thing has been. That then also, of course, can feed into the improvements and course corrections and reorientations that I just mentioned. It can also be about fostering a common culture and sharing knowledge. So simply having the evidence that you require to be able to advertise to a wider range of stakeholders what's going on, or indeed to help inform similar processes elsewhere. So a key element of the GO program itself is to bring people together from many, many different jurisdictions so that they can share lessons, so that you can all learn from each other over the course of the time that you spend together. A fourth example could be about sharing vulnerabilities and damages and costs. So getting a sense of exactly where the pinch points are within your systems and the kinds of things that you need to deal with to adjust from them. And then, of course, producing data. So it is about, there's kind of a research component to this as well. It's generating data that is useful to different sectors to build and adjust their own action plans. So how can the generation of good monitoring and evaluation data inform other adjustments or reorientations that take place elsewhere in your kind of climate and environment and resilience planning system? What are some of the specifics of kind of thinking about adaptation and resilience monitoring? Sorry, about monitoring evaluation when it comes to resilience and adaptation. There are a few things that I think are kind of worth saying here. One is that the nature of the problem of adaptation is really, really nebulous in many cases. So in some respects, you know, we don't always have the data that we need to understand it. And even if we did have all the data that we need, we might still not understand it because adaptation processes are so, you know, sometimes quite invisible, or there's sometimes things that are not easily amenable to be reduced to kind of quantitative data. So tracking adaptation is quite difficult. And this is partly because there's a lack of structured information on climate risk levels. Adaptation related interventions are often not in place, and evidence on effective risk reduction is limited, particularly in places where gathering data is quite difficult or there's not capacity to do this. And there are also difficulties in aggregating kind of local and national level information into wider regional or global perspectives. So what this means is that because there's a lack of clearly defined adaptation goals at the global level, and also that every society has quite different needs or objectives in terms of its adaptation, there are very few reference points for assessing kind of global progress or the gaps that exist internationally. So this is a real problem, right? So that we have the lack of a global or universal indicator of adaptation success, as we do for greenhouse gas emissions. So, you know, the you know, TEQ CO2 essentially is kind of a measure of a carbon credit. We know what we're achieving every time we manage to reduce emissions, or more often than not reduce emission. But how can we actually measure or quantify successful adaptation, particularly when that adaptation is often measured in just improved human lives, which may be a very qualitative thing rather than a quantitative thing. Adaptation is also context specific, as I just suggested. It's multifactorial. So, you know, the adaptation process for one community within a given territory could be quite different for a neighbouring community. There is this lack of clearly defined targets. There's constant evolution of climatic parameters. So the nature of the climate change challenge is changing all the time, both in kind of the broad kind of global mitigation sense, but also in terms of what that means at the local level for communities that have to cope with the multifaceted potential consequences of it, whether we're thinking about, you know, changed disease vectors, invasive species, sea level rise, saltwater intrusion, you know, more frequent hurricanes. There are all manner of different things that different societies have to grapple with that derive from that problem. And as I said just now, there's a lack of structured information on climate risks. So yeah, the problem, broadly speaking, is that there's very little evidence of effective risk reduction, or that evidence is difficult to establish, and there is no baseline to assess progress or gaps. So this is, as I said, quite a nebulous phenomenon. But what are some of the methods that we might think about when trying to develop an M&E framework? Well, there are a number of different methods that we might consider. And again, this is very much context specific. The way in which different societies, communities, bureaucracies develop M&E frameworks kind of rests on the whole range of local contextual factors. You know, how much expertise do they have? What resources do they have? Which communities do they want to connect with? Who do they want to transmit the results to? What kinds of results do they want to transmit? What's actually the purpose of the monitoring? What kind of lessons do they want to draw out from it? What kind of learning do they want to inform? So there are lots and lots of different reasons why you might do monitoring and evaluation and learning activity. Those things will often overlap with each other, but the specific needs of different stakeholders within that process can be quite diverse. And as a consequence, the range of methods they might deploy are quite diverse. So these can be qualitative, they can be asking people about their feelings and their experiences. They can be quantitative, so the generation of much, much harder data, numbers. They can be participative, so you can build in to your actual process of project implementation participatory mechanisms that allow for that ongoing real-time learning that I hinted at the beginning. Or they can be consultative, I suppose, asking what the experts say about the given process. And the more complex the monitoring and evaluation framework that you have, the more likely it is it's going to integrate, more of these dimensions, and will be more sophisticated and have more going on. But it's also the case that if you don't have much in the way of capacity or resource, you can still deploy some of these strategies as a learning, as a process of learning. So if we think back to the last session when Brian and Amy were talking about their experience in the Turks and Caicos Islands, sitting down and playing dominoes with people in a kind of quite insular Haitian community on the territory to build trust and gain an understanding of their experiences. That's a form of monitoring, right? It's a form of evaluation. It's a form of learning. It might have been quite unstructured, but it was a participatory form of finding out what people think about their experiences. And that's really, really useful data that can help to inform the kind of course corrections that I mentioned earlier, and so on. So the simple point here is that there are lots of different methods, and they range across these kind of 4 areas. And within them, there are obviously very, very many different kinds of specific tools that you could deploy. So one way of thinking about this is the kind of the 4th of those that I mentioned, thinking about what the experts say, a kind of consultative process. And this is called the gap track. So the idea of the gap track, the Global Adaptation Process Tracker, is that it kind of supports the scientific community to inform policy making by providing complementary information on adaptation progress to convene stakeholders and discuss adaptation processes. So in a sense, this is about integrating elite knowledges into the process to get a sense of exactly what's happening globally. It structures a framing of adaptation at multiple scales using a common language informed by a specific kind of question matrix. And there are 2 objectives, really. So one is that we're basically trying to understand if we're on track to adapt to climate change. So how well are we doing globally in terms of adaptation? The second is to provide the adaptation community internationally with a common reference for monitoring, assessing and designing adaptation pathways. So in a sense, what we're trying to do with the gap track is work out exactly where we're at globally in terms of generating adaptation. And the approach it takes is to have this question matrix with a scoring system, which is a framework that facilitates broad application at all scales and for different types of what are called representative adaptation challenges. So essentially it's looking at this matrix and working out how well different societies are doing in terms of different dimensions of their adaptation processes. Experts tend to be responsible for the assessment. They must have scientific and policy expertise, as well as experience accumulated in the field as part of the representative adaptation challenge. And the dashboard that they utilize creates a common language between them, as well as between the different dimensions of adaptation. So what this really helps them to do is identify common challenges across those representative adaptation challenges and study systems in order to identify priority areas of action. So it helps the global expert community on adaptation work out kind of what needs to be done in terms of interventions to help us collectively move towards achieving better adaptation outcomes. So some examples of this, for example, could be increasing knowledge on current and future climate risks, understanding the context-specific synergies and trade-offs between different adaptation options and their potential sequencing over time, ensuring that funding mechanisms and project implementation go beyond several years, assessing the effect of adaptation-related policies and actions on current risk reduction, and so on. This work is really, really important because understanding whether we're on track to adapt or not is absolutely vital to help the international community have a common reference point to then design adaptation pathways for different societies. And a major advantage of this approach is that it allows a significant degree of flexibility in evaluation, particularly when information and data may not be available or is of such different types that it is not usually combined. So you might have, in a given society, you might have some quantitative data on some aspects of adaptation policy. You might have a bit of traditional or vernacular knowledge, and you might have a bit of policy development done. And this is probably the case actually in most OCTs, where data tends to be quite patchy for obvious reasons of size and capacity. But this allows real flexibility, because essentially what you've got is experts who may not have all the data at hand, but know enough about how the land lies, are able to bring their expertise together to get a pretty good representative sense of what's going on. And this again is particularly useful, I think, for societies like small islands, so small island developing states and OCTs, where they don't always have the requisite data, but they do have a handful of experts operating in them who do know what's going on and can contribute to these kinds of initiatives. So there are 6 dimensions used by the GapTrack tool, and they're all outlined there on the slide. So knowledge and understanding of observed and future climate risks, adaptation planning and public policy instruments. Again, just thinking about the kinds of expertise that are brought to bear on this process. If you think about when we presented the evidence from the screening that we did of all of the different documents that exist in all of the OCTs, a GapTrack kind of approach to that activity would have been really, really useful if we could have convened a handful of experts from each territory to tell us what we were missing and what we weren't missing. Would have been really, really useful, because that would have had the same kind of effect of just painting in those gaps. So where, they might not know all of the data for, I don't know, coastal inundation or rainfall patterns or whatever it might be, but they do know that, flooding events have got worse in recent years. They do know that there's a significant degree of coastal erosion in certain parts of the territory. And then they can feed that into the process. They know what documents have been published, even though they don't know necessarily all of the contents of all of them, and so on. Anyway, so we've got knowledge and understanding of observed and future climate risks, adaptation planning and public policy instruments, the adequacy and relevance of adaptation actions deployed in the field. So what is this given society, government actually doing? Institutional, technical and financial capacity, how much capacity is there? Evidence or the tangibility of kind of harm reduction progresses. So like what's actually going on here in terms of engaging in adaptation that reduces climate harm. And then the consideration of long-term trajectories in planning. So essentially all of the evidence that the different experts have is accumulated and placed into the matrix according to these different dimensions. And there's a process that they go through when doing this. So the identified experts are gathered together in stage 1 and have a discussion about the matrix, and they begin to score and do a descriptive kind of activity. They then do a round of individual assessments, which are then synthesized and adjusted against the confidence levels that they have about the things that they're claiming. And this is a way, again, of getting over those data gaps. So they can talk about whether they might not have the data for specific phenomena at hand, but because of their expertise, they can state with kind of high or very high or medium confidence that what they're saying is right. There's then a second round of individual expert assessments and another synthesis where they do this again, along with then a final group discussion and feedback and so on, with a final synthesis that they then review that gets published. So what you have here is actually a really sophisticated way of generating a kind of expert consensus on the nature of the extent of adaptation processes globally by convening that expertise in a context where you don't always have the necessary hard data to hand to support the kinds of claims that they're making. And the rating system that they use kind of emphasizes the different kinds of evidence that they may or may not have. So that runs from 0, where there's no evidence for the thing that they're saying, to 4. So no evidence for the adaptation process that takes place, to 4, where there's a kind of strong contribution to adaptation progress. And this diagram is one that Sandrine and Letitia found that shows a kind of the way the matrix plays out in Senegal, looking at different types of, or different parts of the process. So the nature of climate risk, the plans that it has, the actions that it's undertaken, the capacities that it has, and then the process of risk reduction and pathways. That they're the 6 tools that talked about. And that basically is then reviewed. So you can see that in terms of the nature of climate risk, there's quite a lot of confidence about the kind of the extent of the different risks that it faces. There's less confidence, for example, when it comes to kind of, or there's less knowledge, there's less adaptive kind of pressure that is coming in certain other areas. So, you know, with height, if you look at 4.3, for example, there's quite a high level of confidence that Senegal doesn't have enough specific and sustainable funding, let's say. But there's also very, very high confidence that they know what the human drivers of environmental vulnerability are, and so on and so forth. So it just allows for a reasonably accurate picture to be created of the extent of adaptation progress. And you can essentially do this for every country by bringing that expertise together. Another way of achieving these outcomes is through a kind of logical framework. And this brings together a combination of qualitative and quantitative indicators to then weigh up in a very kind of technical way the extent of adaptation. And we're going to use this framework later when we ask you to do a similar activity to this. So doing this, you think about different kinds of logics of intervention. So you look at, for example, the nature of the territory and how climate change is manifesting itself. You then think about specific objectives that you want to achieve, expected results, and the kinds of activities that you might engender. And then these are kind of framed against kind of objectively verifiable indicators. So the kinds of parameters and indicators and so on that may inform your understanding of those different things, so you can kind of work all of those out. Then you have some examples of things that you might want to achieve, and then you think about the examples of indicators by which you can measure the extent of that achievement. So one of the examples here is that you might want to increase your rice production if you farm rice in your territory, increase resilience to drought, where your indicator there would be whether or not you can improve your yields during dry periods. And then they're kind of it's a verifiable indicator of the extent to which the interventions that you deploy may or may not be useful, and so on and so forth. So we'll come back to that later on when we do the practical exercise. So the logical framework, as I said, has a combination of qualitative and quantitative indicators. And essentially, you measure progress along a kind of chain, looking at the different kinds of things that you might want to measure, the extent to which they're measurable or not measurable. They might be things that are again, very qualitative. They're about people's perceptions, they're about assessments of things. And you look at them at different levels. So you think about the different levels of intervention. So you might look at them at the level of the particular program that you're interested in. You might look at individual, family, community systems. You might look at the level of kind of regional, national governance. There are lots of different levels of analysis that you might be interested in addressing. And then you've got to think about the kinds of data you need and the data collection frequency. So there are certain things that you might be collecting on a quite frequent, regular basis. You might even have real-time data systems set up. And then there are other things you might collect much more sporadically. So you might do occasional reviews or assessments where you go and ask people a series of questions or convene town hall meetings or focus groups or other things to engage in your kind of monitoring and evaluation processes. The simple point to take away, though, is that there are lots and lots of different indicators that you can bring together in a framework that can appear to be quite different. Some very, very qualitative, some much more quantitative in nature. And this document is in French, I'm afraid. We couldn't find an English equivalent for it. But this essentially just shows how you might work out kind of how you might systematize different kinds of indicators. So you might have a particular objective that you want to deal with. In this case, it's improving the resilience of ecosystems to climate change. You think about the sector that you want to cope with. You have particular indicators that you then define, and you think, and then you justify kind of how they relate to those indicators. And then you essentially then think about exactly what data you need to collect over what periods of time in order to be able to inform your analysis of that particular process. And then that then gets built into your monitoring evaluation framework. Another tool that is sometimes used is called the TAM tool, tracking adaptation and measuring development. And this was developed by IED. And essentially, this is a tool that has 6 key steps to its effective application. And these can be followed in quite diverse M&E contexts. So firstly, you think about the scope of the M&E activity. You think about what your entry points are, what existing systems exist, so what data do you already have, and what's the purpose of the M&E framework? What are you actually trying to monitor and evaluate and then learn from? The second is thinking about your theory of change. So what are you actually trying to understand in terms of how things should provoke other things to happen? So what are the variables that you're interested in? What is the cause and effect in your system? What are the linkages between those different variables? What are the pathways by which change happens? What are the outputs that you're anticipating seeing? What are the outcomes? What kinds of impact of different phenomena are you interested in? And once you do that, you can then start to build up a picture of what the kind of system that you're looking at actually looks like. What are the different kinds of outcomes that exist? What are the different kinds of inputs as well? The third thing then is thinking about defining and constructing the indicators. So, what is the nature of your climate risk management that you want to look at? What different kinds of resilience are you thinking about? Whose well-being do you want to understand, whether that be the well-being of humans or the well-being of natural systems or the well-being of animals and other fauna, the climate and so on. Then you think about your measuring indicators, like how are you actually going to sample the data? What methods are you going to use? What are the baselines that you're starting from? What indices are you going to draw on? The fifth then is analysing and interpreting the results. And the final one, again, is learning and feeding back into that process of course correction. And this is quite a useful way of thinking about the different steps to go through in developing an M&E framework. And it also helps you think about kind of what already exists that you can draw on to support that learning process without having to build everything immediately from scratch. So there's an example here that shows how you might develop the theory of change and the development of the baselines and indicators in your TAMD tool. The diagram on the left shows a series of different intervention types and different things that could happen with a series of examples that might flow out of them, along with the different kinds of changes, the different outcomes that you might expect to occur through them that you can then seek to measure, along with, on the right, a series of different baselines that you might then develop to measure progress in that system or otherwise. So what are some different dimensions when thinking about M&E activity? There are a few things to say here, and this is to reiterate something that I said earlier, that M&E is often portrayed as the last step in the adaptation cycle following the logic of the process, i.e. it's impossible to monitor or evaluate something that has not yet been planned or implemented following an assessment of the relevant impacts, risks, vulnerabilities, resilience, and so on. But this doesn't imply that M&E can be an afterthought or a component that only comes into play once other steps have been concluded. Again, building climate resilience is a process, just like climate change itself is a process. So M&E should be a core consideration throughout every single step of the process. So when assessing impacts or vulnerability, risks and resilience, you can set the stage for M&E by establishing baselines against which to measure progress following the implementation of the adaptation measures. And adaptation planning, meanwhile, provides the opportunity to envision and initiate an M&E system suitable for the set of actions included in the plan. An important consideration at the planning stage is also how to ensure sufficient and sustainable resources to support monitoring, evaluation and learning over the time horizon during which the planned activities are expected to deliver their adaptation benefit. So it's worth reflecting at this stage whether and how the M&E that will be undertaken can complement and or build upon other relevant M&E systems or requirements, such as the systems that exist at other levels of government or in other sectors outside the adaptation activity, or the requirements set by donors and funds, and so on. I think it's also worth reflecting on the extent to which M&E itself can be an integral part of the adaptation process. So it isn't just the case that what you're trying to do is monitor and evaluate something that is completely separate and outside the process of M&E itself. Actually, good monitoring and evaluation and good learning especially can inform those course corrections that allows the actual adaptive activity to improve. So it's an integral part of the process. It's not just an add-on at the end, even though quite often many organizations do tend to view it in that way, something that's quite problematic. So implementation should signal the beginning, if it hasn't already happened, of the monitoring half of the M&E equation. And it's also important that data and lessons learned needed to enable the evaluation part of the equation are diligently collected and compiled throughout the process. So this diagram here shows a simplified evaluation process that shows basically there are lots and lots of different entry points into the process for this kind of activity. So at the very, very beginning, you've got all of these kind of different decision points. You're clarifying your policy objectives, you're clarifying impacts, you're thinking about the problem definition, and so on and so forth. But at every single stage, you can engage in different kinds of evaluation, different kinds of monitoring processes to build in that kind of learning all the way through the process as it unfolds. And as a consequence then, the framework itself has a whole set of different dimensions. And this is a diagram that is in French as well. It's prepared from the French slides, but it should be fairly straightforward to understand. Essentially, you've got 4 different components here. You've got the context, so thinking about the contextual dimensions of the space in which you're operating. And the question here really is thinking about the political context and identifying the purpose of what it is you're trying to do and target the right users. You've got the content, number 2. So is the focus on the process, or is it on the strategic outcomes, or is it both actually? This is a really, really important thing to think about when you're building monitoring evaluation frameworks from the ground up. Are you actually trying to understand if the thing you've carried out has been done successfully, or are you interested in whether the thing you've carried out has led to good outcomes or the right kinds of outcomes? And those two things don't always sit in balance. It might be actually that the process itself hasn't gone very well, but you've achieved good outcomes. Or it might be that the process, you carried it out perfectly, it just hasn't had the expected effect. Or it may be that you've carried it out perfectly and it's had exactly the right outcomes. Either way, there are many different answers that you can potentially give to that question, which again should inform the process of learning that feeds back into the process as it continues. Thinking also about what data and information you need. I've already talked about this. It's really, really important to have a good sense of exactly what it is that you want. What are you trying to find out here? Who do you need to speak to? What things do you need to get from them? What data does already exist that you can draw on? And do you need to define some adaptation specific indicators? So what are the actual indicators that are specific to the adaptation process in the context in which you're trying to work, that you're trying to generate knowledge about? The third step then is operationalization. So thinking about how you actually implement these processes. And there are questions here about who do you include? What institutions and resources should be involved? Whose data sources do you rely on if you're thinking about existing data? And who do you speak to if you want to generate some new data? If you're going to do assessments of some kind of coastal process, you want to work out the impact on, let's say, fishing communities. Well, how do you decide which fishing communities to go into? You probably can't speak to everybody. So how do you ensure a broad enough base of voice and expertise that feeds in the qualitative parts of the data sets that you need, if indeed you're doing that kind of work. How do you then synthesize the information when you get it? How do you sift it? How do you decide what is important and what isn't? How much heed do you pay to kind of outlier types of information? This is a really, really difficult question to answer. You know, you might get lots and lots of people saying similar things, but you might get a couple of people who say something completely different. Do you discount the people who are the outliers because they don't accord with the common consensus? Or actually, do you listen to them because their experience might tell you that the common consensus isn't quite right, actually, and that there are alternative ways of thinking about what's happened? What do you do when you are overwhelmed with huge amounts of quantitative data where there is lots of data available? That can be as much of a problem in M&E work actually as not having enough data. Sometimes you can be overwhelmed by the amount of data that you have to sift through. So what strategies do you have for dealing with that when there's almost too much, when there's data overload? How do you make sense of it when there's reams and reams of it? And how do you use an existing M&E framework? Is there already something else? Is there already something in place that you can draw on to help support that? And then the final stage here is communication. So how will the results and data be communicated, and to whom are you communicating them? Is this an internal process that facilitates learning within a quite narrow, say, elite bureaucracy within your territory? Is it just for your office? Is it something that you communicate to donors and funders? Is it something you communicate to citizens at large? Is it something that you publish quite widely? Is it something that is kept fairly quiet? What do you do if the results are not what you expected? What do you do if the results are not very good? What do you do if the results tell a really, really great story, but you're not quite sure how to package it? Again, there are lots of really difficult questions or thorny questions that you have to think about when trying to work out exactly what you're going to do with the kind of lessons that you've learned from the process. So there are a huge number of questions to think about potentially when designing a framework. But the more you think through these different steps, in a way, the more simple your framework can be and the more powerful it can be. So what are some of the different types of indicators? A few things to think about here. And one is sort of a simple, perhaps obvious point, that in most M&E schemes, there are indicators of some kind that are deployed to define what will actually be measured. So, you know, even if you've got an M&E framework that is quite light on quantitative data, maybe it is something that's very, very qualitative. It's, you know, it's interested in people's experiences, and it asks, you know, kind of open-ended questions for people to think about. Even then, you still have some indicators. You have some kind of way of determining how you're going to then make sense of the information that you're given. And indicators are useful for at least two reasons. One is that they help you describe an existing situation. Another is that they help you to track change over time. So there has to be some kind of constancy in that process, particularly if you're doing multiple evaluations over a period of time. And for each of those indicators, it's necessary to meet a few kind of benchmarks. One is that the criteria have to, or the indicators have to be of good quality. So they have to be relevant, they have to be valid, they have to be measurable, and so on. Again, they don't always have to be measurable in very, very narrow quantitative terms, but you have to have some kind of framework by which you can make sense of it. So even if you're asking for kind of quite rich qualitative feedback, if you're interested in people's perceptions, you still need some kind of framework by which you can make sense of what they're telling you, to measure the significance of what they're saying, I suppose. You should have an accurate reference database and target values. This is particularly important when we're thinking about quantitative indicators. You need to know what you're comparing against. So this is partly, again, a question of baselines. What are you comparing it to originally? But it's also about just thinking about, well, where do you want to go? What do you think should be the accurate measurement here? What is the kind of ballpark of what we should be aiming for? So you can get a sense of how the thing you're learning relates to kind of what it could be or where it should be. And you have to have a way to verify the value of what's being said. So or what's being studied or what's being learned. So you have to know that the data you're getting, you know, is telling you something useful, is telling you something meaningful. It's not just a kind of random piece of information. the value of which is not clear. And again, to go back to the example that I used earlier, this can be very, very difficult when you're dealing with quite highly qualitative data, particularly where you get quite differing assessments of the nature of a problem. Thinking through where you actually situate your understanding or your analysis of the significance of the things that you're being told, because that can be quite tricky sometimes. Okay, so thinking now about different kinds of indicators and the kinds of precision with which you might apply them. This slide kind of speaks to the way in which you have sort of different inputs into the process. What exactly is it that you're putting into the evaluation process, and what are you actually trying to achieve? So in a sense, inputs are the financial, human and material resources that are used for the adaptation intervention. And they should then, of course, result in outputs, i.e. the products and services which result from the completion of those adaptation activities. After that, you get outcomes, and essentially the outcomes are the intended or achieved short-term and medium-term effects of an intervention's output. In the longer term, the adaptation interventions result in impacts. So the impacts can be positive or negative. Forces beyond the control of the project may influence impact considerably, and this can lead to what is sometimes called an attribution gap, i.e. the project itself has either has achieved some kind of unintended outcomes, or some unintended outcomes have hit the project, and the project wasn't there. So you can't decide whether the project was successful or not, because you don't know how far external phenomena are significant in generating outcomes. So all of this is worth thinking about in terms of those different kinds of indicators. So if thinking about the targets or objectives, you've got to think about how successfully climate resilience is mainstreamed into all sectoral or local policies. So that's kind of your ultimate objective, I guess. The ultimate objective of adaptation interventions is that we have really, really significantly high levels of climate resilience mainstreamed across all sectors, and then we can go home. Although we can't, because as I've said, it's still an ongoing process. We would still need to continue the resilience mainstreaming process because the nature of the climate challenge would continue to change. But that's your kind of end objective. What are the other targets or objectives that you can have along the way to meet that? How do you determine what they are? How do you think about what they are within a given society? In terms of then the inputs that go into that process, well, what is the volume of financing that's been mobilized? How much human capital do you have to invest in the adaptation initiative? What's the output? An example here is the number of people trained on resilience, but there might be other kinds of outputs that you can think about there in terms of that kind of development of resilience capacity. What are the results in terms of the changes? What are the outcomes that result from the implementation of adaptation policies? So what has been the assessment of the increase of particular kinds of successful adaptive shifts? And what have been the other wider impacts? So what have been the changes in environmental, economic and social indicators that you've observed? What has been the ability in this example of green spaces to address heat islands or severe weather events? How well have you achieved the adaptation thing that you want to achieve? So this is the way to think about the different kinds of indicators. We need indicators at every stage of the adaptation process. We need them when we think about inputs, we need them when we think about outputs, we need them when we think about outcomes, and we need them when we think about impact, the actual extent of adaptation at the end. And again, in a moment when we get to the Miro board, we're going to get you to break all of this down a little bit in terms of thinking about different kinds of indicators that you might want to include in your own M&E, hypothetical M&E frameworks. This is a diagram that we looked for to find in English, but we couldn't, unfortunately, and it's in French. And it's a diagram that shows the different kinds of adaptive initiatives that occur at kind of different levels of governance within different kinds of territories. And essentially what this shows really is just the idea that if you're trying to find out different kinds of adaptation measures at different levels, so, what are you trying to find out at the territorial level in order to work out what indicators you then need to find that thing out once you work that out, what are the strategies that you're then going to deploy in order to understand the impacts of those phenomena on those different levels of analysis? And then there are kind of a whole set of composite indicators that you might want to think about when developing your frameworks. And a composite indicator is typically seen to be a compromise between a data-driven and a kind of user-driven model. And this is something that broadly maps onto that qualitative distinction that I mentioned earlier. And this comes from the fourth report of the Inform concept and methodology. This is a composite indicator that identifies countries at risk of humanitarian crisis, so not purely kind of climate focused crisis, but a risk of humanitarian crisis or disasters that could overwhelm national response capacity. And this index supports a proactive crisis and disaster management framework. It began in 2012 as a convergence of interests of UN agencies and donors and NGOs and research institutions, trying to establish a common evidence base for global humanitarian risk analysis. It's based on risk concepts published in kind of the scientific literature, and it envisages three dimensions of risk: so hazard exposure, vulnerability, and lack of coping capacity. So, when all of those things coalesce, how well are you able to manage kind of situations of crisis and so on? And it's split into different levels to provide a quick overview of the underlying factors leading to humanitarian risk. And it's got kind of 54 core indicators. But you can see here, you've got those three main dimensions at the top. Hazard and exposure is divided into two kinds of hazards. So you've got natural hazards on the one side, human hazards on the other. Vulnerability is, on the one hand, socioeconomic. So what actually are the kind of causes or the types of vulnerability that exist? And then you've got who are the groups that are affected by them. And then the lack of coping capacity. On the one hand, you've got the nature of the institutional structures to cope on the one hand, and then you've got the infrastructures on the other side. And underneath all of that, you've got, as you can see, all of these different types of components that fit into those different categories. So although this isn't a climate adaptation set of indicators here, you can see how very quickly you can build a framework by thinking about the different relevant indicators in your territory or your society that allow you to work out exactly what the different things or dimensions that you're trying to measure are when working out and evaluating exactly how far progress has gone in adaptation. And then looking at this multidimensional vulnerability index, this is something that some of the development banks really like. The Asian Development Bank is quite interested in this, and the World Bank uses it a lot. This is a similar kind of composite indicator process that essentially just shows where countries lie on a spectrum between the extent of their structural vulnerability and their lack of resilience, and what that means in terms of their ability to withstand shocks or crises. And you can think of lots and lots of other composite indicators. There are loads of them. So there's, the kind of the Freedom House report on the extent to which, countries are democratic or not. There's the World Bank World Governance indicators as well. There are lots and lots of different composite indicator sort of databases that you can draw on, and they essentially form the same kind of process as any kind of other monitoring and evaluation framework. They evaluate essentially how well different societies are doing according to a whole set of different criteria to make some assumptions about the bigger sort of puzzle or problem that they're interested in. Okay. Does anybody want to come in with any questions at this point, or does anybody want to say anything? I'd be very interested to hear from anyone that has had experience of running M&E processes in their own territories, if they'd like to share them, or if anybody wants to disagree with anything we've said, or if anybody wants to build on anything that we've said. Has anybody in the room carried out an M&E process or been involved in one, whether or not to do with adaptation or
not? We've done that here for Turks and Caicos Islands. We've done that here for hurricane risk and vulnerability assessment, but only on that very specific component. Basically, it's done by the Department of Disaster Management and Emergencies. And we used to be in the same ministry with them, so we were seconded over to them whenever there was a disaster. So we had the trainings. That doesn't seem to happen as much anymore, but we have that capacity here. Yeah.
Yeah. I would have thought, I mean, my assumption is, and this is intuitive rather than based on any knowledge, my assumption is that in a lot of kind of small island territories, the most monitored and evaluated entity would probably be the disaster risk reduction system of some kind, given, particularly in the Caribbean, given kind of exposure to hurricanes and volcanic eruptions and so on. So that would be something that has quite a big infrastructure behind it and is regularly monitored. My assumption would be that elsewhere in the governing system, monitoring and evaluation might be something that occurs more sporadically, and it depends on the nature of the project or the initiative. But again, I could be completely wrong on that. That's just an intuitive assumption. It'd be great to hear any other experiences that people have. What about your experience, Courtney? I'm going to pick on you. You've carried out lots of projects across the region, maybe not always to do with adaptation activity. What's your sense of how well integrated M&E programs are?
You know, it depends on the entity that is carrying it out and the capacity that they have. So working with the World Bank and the IDB, they have good capacity and experts that they tend to rely on. And so, you know, it makes the process easier. But I think one of the things that I didn't see come out much in some of the examples of M&E that you gave, it came out in the TAMD one, but not in the previous ones, is the importance of getting baseline data. Because if you don't know where you are, you won't be sure of where you want to go. And one of the other important things that didn't quite come out is very verifiable indicators and the importance of having it. Because one of the important questions you have to ask, having established your baseline data, is what will success look like? If you don't know what success is going to look like for you, or for your different stakeholders, then you won't know if you were successful or not. And that's one of the really important things in monitoring and evaluation. The next critical thing is that baseline data is usually not very easy to come by. And that's one of the challenges that a lot of small countries have. So sometimes you're trying to do a project, and sometimes before the project even gets started, you have to spend another 6 months, sometime another year, just to collect the baseline data to see what your starting point is. So usually when it comes to project, you have to build that in at the get-go. To understand what information you want to collect and whether the information is available. And just the next key thing from my experience is sometimes that we put a lot, and you spoke about this quite a lot, Matt, about, you know, the importance of quantitative versus qualitative data, because the focus usually tends to be on quantitative data, but not on qualitative data, or how the quantitative data can be used to tell a story. So a lot of times people just want to spit numbers at you, numbers that don't mean anything unless you can put it in a context that describes how it actually affects people's lives. And so one of the key things that come out just looking at projects that we do in other countries is that one of the things that we don't do when establishing baseline data is have a gender component in it, to look at how climate adaptation affects women different from how it affects men, how it affects the elderly different from how it affects young people, how it affects vulnerable groups such as LGBT community, etc. And then build this into the kind of outcome that you want to achieve. And so when you have all these different stakeholders that you must develop policies for, sometimes, like you mentioned, it can be difficult to create indicators and to monitor them in order to understand what your outcome is going to be.
I think there's two really important points that you've raised there, as I see it. So one is the kind of the baseline data, and that it seems to me that there's a is it a paradox? Is it ironic? I'm not sure. That the fact that part of the reason that you don't have baseline data quite often is because the M&E process wasn't carried out previously. So you're kind of already starting on quite shaky foundations sometimes.
Yes.
So thinking about what your baseline is and what you can collect or what is already existing is really, really important at that outset. But I also think this marrying of quant and qualitative data is really, really important. I mean, I often think that we always talk about, again, particularly in the Caribbean, we talk a lot about not having enough data. We don't have enough data. That's right. There aren't enough surveys of all manner of things, whether they're focused on adaptation, climate, or any other aspect of the kind of development panorama. We don't have enough quantitative data, but even if we did have enough quantitative data, it wouldn't be able to tell us everything that we know. And I often worry there's a bit of a danger that we assume that there is this kind of holy grail that you might reach one day where you've got enough data. But even then, if you don't have the qualitative story, as you say, to make sense of it, you can almost be lulled into a bit of a false sense of security where you think, well, we've got all the data we need now, therefore we can understand what's going on. But you might actually miss really important contextual effects or consequences or outcomes of the process that you're interested in if you don't have that qualitative understanding of your sort of people's perceptions of it.
One of the key mantras that must be remembered is pretty common, and it's said all the time that not everything that matters can be measured, and not everything that can be measured matters. And it's a key thing in going into M&E, because sometimes, the things that really matter, you try to come up with ways to measure them, but you really can't. So then what do? Do you go ahead with a project, or do you not go ahead with a project? Simply because you won't be able to say whether you were successful or not. So like you said, it's really important that you could have all the information at your disposal, but having all of that data may not be able to tell you what is really, really necessary for you to know at the end of the day. So that's one of the things why M&E is really not a foolproof method in terms of development and how you go about trying to improve people's lives. And then again, why stories are critical, why it's always necessary to just talk to people and let them tell you word of mouth how different policies are improving their lives and whether their lives have become better as a result of certain things having been done. And I think at the end of the day, that's what really matters, right? Not the numbers you collect. But donors don't particularly see it that way. They won't let go the next tranche of funding unless you can show them something in a quantitative format. So,
you got to find a balance. Does anybody else want to come in on any of this? Or should we move on to the next activity? Debbie, please.
Hiya. You might actually cover this later on, so apologies if I'm jumping the gun, but I'd be interested to understand the recommendations for the frequency of data collection and sort of the analysis or the overview of that impact, because I am sort of in the process of starting to look at what indicators would be most appropriate. And you can go down a bit of a rabbit hole, I think, of trying to collect as much data as possible. But obviously you want to try and select the data, both qualitative and quantitative, that are going to have the most impact of different areas. But then that also leads to how frequently does that need to be collected? Is it on a case-by-case basis, depending on what the indicator is? And then how frequently would you actually sort of have an overview of that impact?
That's a great question. I mean, what's your sense in terms of your own experience? What's your sense of what the answer to that is? How are you kind of navigating that?
I'm at the very, very beginning of sort of exploring this, to be honest. So at the moment, I'm looking at climate hazards. And so again, we've got a large lack of data here. So implementing an environmental monitoring network that will then, just by its sort of type, naturally, you'd sort of look at it on a monthly, seasonal and annual basis just to sort of try and understand changes there. And then so that cascades then through to the various different impacts that might have on different sectors. So I suppose then the natural thing might be for us in terms of sort of extreme weather events that may have influenced tourism events and sort of that sort of thing. So I think it does lend itself to different timescales, but then it can get quite messy in terms of, have you actually got a full overview of how things are progressing? I don't know sort of what the best way of approaching that would be.
Yeah, so really, they're really difficult questions, aren't they? Because there's a whole set of other sort of extraneous constraints, if that's the right way of putting it, on the process as well. Like, what resources do you have? Is there a danger of overburdening yourselves? How do you know when you've got enough data? How much is enough? Is actually the name of the game trying to be very comprehensive, or is it the fact that we just need a good enough amount of data to inform the things that we want to learn about and improve the process? I think there's a whole set of other questions there about sort of the time frames over which you collect data, not just in terms of the sequencing as you talked about it, but also, like, you know, can you build data over time? So, you know, is there a sense that actually we can do this much for now, and then, you know, in the coming months and years we can gradually scale up more and more, and then we'll have a bigger database of evidence. And I don't think there's any right or wrong answers to any of it. I think a lot of it is just really, really contextual. And, you know, there is obviously, dependent on the specific kinds of things you're trying to measure, there'll be best practice examples from other places where, you know, people have grappled with these questions and, you know, put in place frameworks that work for them, but they might not, and it's unlikely actually that they'll translate wholesale to your particular context. So my sense is that a lot of organizations just figure this out a little bit as they go. But it sounds to me like you're asking all the right questions and thinking. I mean, the way you describe thinking in terms of, you know, kind of seasonal data is probably quite a useful way of thinking it. But then again, that might not translate to another place, right? So if you're in the tropics where you don't have 4 seasons or two seasons, and those seasons are increasingly looking a bit blurry, perhaps because of rainfall patterns and heat patterns and so on, suddenly you then have some very other complicated questions to ask. I don't know what the answer is, I suppose, is that's a long-winded way of saying that, but I'd love to know what other people think. Or I don't know if you want to come back on that, Debbie. Sorry, go on, Eric.
Can I comment?
Yeah.
I think one possible source of information is probably using some of the technology, using, for example, satellite. The old Landsat data, then you compare with the recent images. So you can go back and see the changes in, for example, in vegetation. Another one is dendrochronology. If you try to cut some trees, and you can see in the annual rings whether there was a flooding, there was a drought, etc., in a certain year, and you can count the years from the ring of the tree. So those are some of the possible potential sources of information in the past that we don't have records. So we can reconstruct record using those methods. Thank you.
Brilliant. Yeah, absolutely. So that kind of work is just really, really important for helping you to frame all of these kinds of agendas, for sure. Would anybody else like to come in at this point? Okay. Well, I think we can move on to our practical exercise now. We've got a decent amount of time left. What we're going to try and do is design an M&A approach. So we're going to use the Miro board. Again, hopefully it's a bit more straightforward than the very first Miro board that we used. And if anybody, again, doesn't feel comfortable with the Miro board, feel free to just do this activity on a piece of paper as it's sort of laid out on the slide here. And there are 2 rounds to this. So we're going to split everybody into 2 groups again. Half of you will go into group 2 and work on board 2. The other half will go into group 1 and work on board 1. And the board has like 2 sections to it, essentially, and it has sticky notes that are color coded for each territory. Again, the first part of the board, round 1, as we've called it here, is identifying the purpose of the M&E framework and the target users. So the kind of scenario here is that you are in charge of pre-developing an M&A framework for your territory or sector, so you can make it up, whatever seems interesting to you. Can you define the purpose, scale, and target users in your territory or sector? And just to remind you of kind of what we said earlier, thinking about learning. So how do you generate knowledge about the changing context and the needs and the feedback loops? Are the adaptation actions effective? How can adaptation be improved? Think about accountability. So what are you doing here? Are you reporting to stakeholders to inform, well, you are reporting to stakeholders to inform them of their progress and or results, but how can that progress be reported on in terms of kind of international agreements or national adaptation targets or whatever? So think about who is the audience for this M&E activity. And then think also about adaptive management. So thinking about if a policy or plan or action is on track and how you might adjust the course of action accordingly. So how do you feed course correction into this process? And the question here is, you know, whether or not the execution has been carried out in accordance with what was originally intended. So that's the first job, is to, and you'll see there's a bunch of criteria on the board. Think about developing, you know, identifying the purpose and the users of your M&E framework. And then the second round is implementing or planning resilience actions. So can you define an overall objective, a specific objective? You might not need to bother with the overall objective. You might just go to the specific objective, and then a kind of expected result from that and one or two corresponding activities. And then can you associate them with a few indicators of different types to measure it? And this is the diagram here that I showed earlier that just shows, you know, the way you think about that. So thinking about the kind of objective, then thinking about the indicators that go with it. So I will pop the link to the Miro board in the chat. I'll just open it on my computer. And then we'll split everybody into rooms and we'll take about 35 minutes for this activity. And then we'll come back for a collective discussion at the end that Courtney is going to facilitate. Okay, so just trying to get can't seem to get the chat up for some reason. It's not, the drop down doesn't seem to be working on this. I don't know why that's happening. Okay, here we go. Right, so that's the link to the Miro board. Can everybody see that okay? And I'll now just pop everybody into two groups for the next half an hour or so. Okay. Okay. Okay, so you should all have had an invite for the breakout rooms now. And as I say, if you're not comfortable with the Miro board, feel free to just do this activity separately on a piece of paper.
Everybody, welcome back to the main room. Hope that was a useful activity. I'm signing off at this point because I have another commitment that I have to dash off to. But Courtney is going to guide you through the last 10 minutes with an open conversation. And I just want to say thanks a lot. I've really enjoyed the last couple of weeks of sessions. It's been really, really interesting for me. And I really hope we will get to see each other in Brussels in October. But I'll hand over to Courtney at this point, who's now the host of the meeting, and hopefully see you all again at some point in the not too distant future. Thanks.
Thanks, Matt. Bye.
All right. Thanks, Matt.
Thank you.
Thanks, Matt.
All right, everybody, we only have 10 minutes left. And for that 10 minutes, I I just want to because we had a very we had an ongoing discussion in our group about, you know, identifying indicators and, you know, separating outcomes from objectives, and what's the difference between an objective and an outcome, and how do you identify an indicator? How do you, you know, determine what an indicator is? So I'm wondering, you know, in your different groups, you know, what difficulty may you have had in putting together, you know, your different projects or your different scenarios that you were thinking about, and you know, what are some of the concepts that you may have found difficult in grasping? So that way we can probably share our knowledge and understanding, so that, you know, we all on the same page in terms of what certain things are, you know, how we define certain things, or whether they can be defined in a static way, or whether, you know, things are dependent on projects.
I don't have a specific response to that question, but my major comment would be that I think it's kind of representative of the challenges that policymakers themselves may have because of the conflation of these same concepts that you've mentioned. So from where I sit, I would see some gaps in policy implementation, the lulls and the lags in terms of timelines, in terms of when a policy is in draft, in terms of when it gets to that implementation phase. And I do wonder whether there is that, and as well, trying to convey a particular message around whether it's resilience or energy transition to a local audience. So you're dealing with those number of things, and then the conflation of the concepts, which perhaps makes it more challenging to get to a place where you are making inroads into seeing the changes and to really having some impact where adaptation or mitigation may be concerned. So I think that that is probably representative of some of the real challenges that policymakers, you know, persons in government, even in civil society groups, the challenges that they have with kind of streamlining concepts and issues that would help us to make decisions much more quickly around a particular issue.
That's true. That's definitely true. And like we had mentioned before, you know, just kind of trying to decide what a country's objectives should be. You know, it goes back to the example what someone said earlier. I think it was the second workshop, where not everybody is convinced about climate change. You know, and it begs the question of whether it's a matter of people in our context, in small island developing states as tiny as ours. It's not that we're not convinced that climate change is happening, but whether or not we should be bearing the brunt of putting in place mitigation measures, you know, to mitigate climate change, and whether or not we can even do it. So, you know, this push toward green energy, for example, in going back to what you said earlier, Genevieve, you know, if a government puts in place a policy to move toward green energy, it's going to be expensive for people. You know, a push toward, for example, hybrid vehicles, which are more expensive than gas-powered vehicles. Then for us in small countries, we are going to ask, why should we have to do that? Because at the end of the day, we hardly emit, you know, greenhouse gases. So are we supposed to bear the brunt of mitigating climate change? And even if we are, how can we do it in a way that isn't a strain on our resources, which we have very little of to even begin with? So when you think about these policies, they're really not easy to make at all, especially when you think about, you know, satisfying different parties and getting different groups to come together. So when you have governments having objectives of public buses. We are going to reduce the number of gas-powered public buses by 50% by 2025, then it creates a challenge, because then, this has to be imported and it's going to cost a lot of money, and then the infrastructure is not there. The mechanics are not there, to fix these buses when they break down. You don't have charging stations for them, and a whole lot of things are just not in place. So like you said, sometimes, in our context is we try to rush ahead to make policies around climate adaptation that we don't have the supporting infrastructure or the knowledge to accommodate. And so that in itself create difficulties in terms of developing M&E frameworks to map out our objectives and outcomes. I don't know if anybody else has anything they want to say on that.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Do you have any like M&E frameworks, like actual documents, like from different like Caribbean countries or OTs or whatever? Because that would be really useful to actually reference.
Yeah. Yeah,
That would be helpful.
That's a very good suggestion. So I'm going to ask Letitia to put one up related to climate adaptation, because from my experience and the projects that I've worked on are mostly private sector development projects, and the M&E frameworks and the logic frameworks usually tend to be a bit different. And like Matt said, it's really not a one size fits all where you can use a pre-existing M&E framework for any and anything. It's usually something you have to develop on a case-by-case basis in a lot of cases. Some cases you could take something that is pre-existing and modifying it within a particular sector, within a particular project, depending on what it's related to and what you're trying to achieve. So I'll ask her to put something up that is more related to climate adaptation. But I'm sure there are a lot out there. So one of the examples I gave was that, I have one from a previous project, but it's in pretty raw form. And, so the objective is to increase beneficiary countries and territories' climate change resilience. And the objective is beneficiary countries and territories have increased knowledge, skills, and competencies to integrate and mainstream climate change resilience into policies and regulations. So this would be the objective, and the results or the outcome would be policymakers have acquired basic knowledge about climate change issues. So an indicator to this, just one indicator, because usually projects have many indicators, would be the number of participants that attend trainings to develop their knowledge and skills and competencies to integrate and mainstream climate change. So remember, this is just one indicator. It could be, you could be many others. An indicator could be the number of training courses you had. An indicator could be the number of trainees that goes back to their jobs and say that they're satisfied with the training they got, and it's helping them in their day-to-day work. So an indicator for that last one would be 80% of participants trained said that they understood the material and are able to apply it to their day-to-day work. That's a good indicator to use. Another indicator would be like, out of a country with 100 people working in the ministry, 70 of them attend the training. That's a good indicator to use. So it would be an indicator for that would be number of participants that attend the training. We want 70. So 70 would indicate that we're on our way to achieving our targets. Below that, then we know we're not on our way to achieving the outcome or the target or the objective. So a means of verification for that would be the number, a list. So a means of verification would be a tangible document that you can use as proof. So at the start of the training, you might have a registration sheet, and the registration sheet has the list of people who participate, and that list you would use to verify that you are, accomplishing what you set out to accomplish in the project, and it would feed into the indicator. So the list of participants would tell you that from this list, 80 people turned up. Our indicator was the number of people who turn up, and that number was 70. And now that we have 80, this indicates to us that we are on our way to achieving our results. So, but it takes practice to actually really understand a lot of these things. So even if you sit down and pore over a document, you'll have an understanding of it, but having worked with it, it will develop your understanding a whole lot more. So we're 1 minute over, and just before we go, Matt just noted that I should mention that, this is not the end of the training program. We're still working on the screening, using some of the information that we've got from you as we went about this workshop. And that Ramble is developing a quick governance scan tool, and there'll be a workshop in October in Brussels that focal points will be identified in each of the different countries, and people will be flown over to Brussels to take part in a 3-day workshop. And it will pretty much be, a similar version to this that we have here, but perhaps more or less intense, I'm not sure. So that's the PSA, and it's 2.6. It's 2:06 here in the UK. So we're 2 minutes over 2 hours. So
yeah, thank you. Thanks, Courtney. Sorry, maybe you were not finished. I would just like to say a final word afterwards, please.
Please do. I'm finished. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, so on behalf of the overall Green Overseas team, I would like to thank all of you participants who have been so concentrated through all of these online trainings. It's not easy to do that online, and I would like to congratulate everybody for that. I would also like to thank, of course, you, Courtney and Matt, for the quality trainings that you have provided. Thank you very much for this. I would just like to excuse my colleague Martin, who was there to open the session today, but he had to leave for an emergency before the end of the training. So he asked me to kindly excuse himself for not being here at the end of this training. And as you just mentioned, Courtney, we might have a chance to see each other during the hybrid workshop in October in Brussels. And while we are waiting for this event to come up, I would like to reiterate my invitation for you to join the Green Overseas online platform, of course, which you have maybe already done. I see some names that I have already seen on the platform, so that's a good sign. I don't think we have the link right here. I would need a second, but we're already over time. So I would just explain to you how you can find the link. You go onto your navigator, and then you put Green Overseas. And at the very bottom of the first page, when you scroll down, you will see Go Platform. And so you may want to register for that. Yeah, Gail, I know there's an issue with your registration. We're on it with the administrators of the platform, so I hope it will be resolved very soon now. Thanks. But yeah, please stay in touch. Don't hesitate also to just send a little message in case you want to follow up on something in particular that you have heard during the training. And then we will be happy to stay in touch with you. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
All the best.
Thanks for good training.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Bye. Thank you.